poof, this demon flies out. I knew it was evil. And then it dawned on me, this thing came out of me. And so I freaked out. I'm just sitting there and I know he wants me. I said, whatever, do what you're going to do. And so then all these other demonic spirits were just like starting to come out of like everywhere. And they just wanted me. And all of a sudden I see like this old lady's face appear in the wall and she's whispering something to me. I'm like, what? And she's like, the other side. And I said, what do you mean the other side? And she was like, they're here to take you to the other side. And then after that, my heart dropped. Then I got scared. I remember just hitting my knees right there and I cried out to God and I said, God, I said, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. And all of a sudden I look up.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to God's Voice. Today, I am your host, Vladimir Proknevsky, and I have another powerful interview for you with my friend Art Mace, who experienced a supernatural encounter with demons. And then he had a face-to-face conversation with Jesus himself. So you do not want to miss this interview. But before I play it for you, I want to quickly tell you about something very exciting. So today, I launched a brand new private standalone community that's absolutely free to you. And you can join it at family.godsvoiceday.com. And the reason why I created this community, because I want people that love near-death experiences, supernatural encounters, Jesus testimonies, and things of that nature to join that community and share your testimonies, be encouraged by them, and also encourage others as well. So join us at family.godsvoiceday.com. And I look forward to chatting with you inside the community. But until then, here is my conversation with Art Mace. Enjoy. Art, let's back it up. So I know you had this amazing experience, this encounter with both the light and the darkness. But before all of that, can you kind of set the stage for what your life was like?
So before I had my experience, I had an identical twin brother. We were like best friends, you know what I mean? When we were kids and, started off smoking cigarettes, kind of like teenage years and stuff like that. And we never really like wanted to be home and stuff. Once we were able to like go out and play with our friends and stuff like that, it was like we wanted to be outside and be with our friends and stuff. I had a stepdad who was like really strict when we were young. And so we kind of just wanted to be like, when we could be outside and play, that's what we'd go do. But, just started getting high. I think I was probably like maybe like 12 years old. You know what I mean? When we started, might even been maybe even 11. And I remember the first time, like I got high, it jacked me up pretty good. You know what I mean? Like I didn't really enjoy it. It almost made me sick. But I remember like my twin brother, my friend, they were laughing and I'm just sitting there laying down, just saying, man, I can't wait till this is over. You know what I mean? So that was the first time we spent the night at a buddy's house and then it kind of just took off from there. Then we tried it again. And then I think maybe the second time I liked it. And then next thing you know, it was kind of like we were kind of chasing it. So then what happened after that is we started getting in trouble. We actually started stealing and just trying to get money for our habits. And we ended up getting in trouble. I want to say we were like 14 years old. We ended up breaking into a house. It was me and my twin brother and my best friend at the time. And we ended up getting in trouble. We got caught at the mall. We had like all kinds of money from the house that we broke into. My friend's mom found out who's, the house that we broke into. And, she put two and two together. And that was actually like my buddy's friend who lived down the street. We had to go to court and all that stuff. My mom having to take off of work, just to take me and my twin brother to court. And the judge pretty much put us on probation. And so the stipulations with that was, the judge said you're going to be on UAs and you're going to be in a drug rehab program, outpatient. And so at that time, my mom was like, she's like, all right, you guys want to mess around? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to split you guys up. So she split up me and my twin brother and I went to go live with my aunt. So I was pretty much living with my aunt at the time. But then I think it was ninth grade. I just remember I was going to school and I was still getting high, man. I was, smoking weed. And what ended up happening was I kept dropping hot UAs. And then so after that, my auntie and my mom, they put together a sting operation on me. It's kind of like how I remember it. I ended up going to the 10th grade and I had a job at the time and I had to go see my drug counselor that day, I remember. And it was supposed to be like some meeting. So I walk in there and I sit down at this long table and I see like my drug counselor there. I see, I think like, probation. And there was just a bunch of people in there, including my mom, my auntie. And they pretty much just said, you know what? You're just not getting it. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to jail. And they're like, you're going to be in juvenile hall until the drug inpatient program opens up for you. And so I was just kind of like, it was a bombshell on me. I kind of felt betrayed. And so what ended up happening is I ended up going to juvenile hall, and I was there, I want to say 2.5 months. And then from there, the drug inpatient program opened up for me. They ended up transporting me there. And that's where I lived from like 10th grade year. So from 10th grade till my senior year, I was in that inpatient program, and I lived there, and I was with a bunch of other guys in there, kids my age and stuff. And they all had the same thing going on with them. It was just chasing drugs and getting in trouble. That was pretty much the last stop for me before I was going to end up doing more time, or I was going to get popped for doing worse things. You know what I mean? And so when you got out of that program, a lot of people ended up going to prison and stuff like that, But the thing was there was a counselor there who would take us to church. And it was my first time going to a Christian church. I remember going to that church, and it was like I felt peace for the first time in my life. And I remember going there, and everyone was just happy. Everybody was singing, and it was just like, wow, I mean, there was kind of like hidden motives there. We were a bunch of young guys going there. You know what I mean? There was pretty women there and stuff. But aside from all that, man, it was like, for me, I knew that like this was the answer, like God, peace. I remember even thinking like, man, if I was to die today, I just feel like I was going to go home. I was going to go with God. Didn't really have a whole lot of knowledge of Jesus Christ. Didn't really have a whole lot of knowledge of the Bible and stuff like that. I just knew that something was different there, and that's what I wanted. I was just at peace the whole time. And then there was a youth pastor who would come over to our home, and he would do a Bible study, and he would teach us about Jesus, And what fascinated me is he said, did you know that Jesus is coming back one day? And I was like, what do you mean? And he's just like, yeah, he's coming back. He's coming back for, those who believe in him. And so I remember laying there in my bunk at night, looking out. I still remember to this day, just looking out the window and just looking up into the sky and just saying, wow, I can't wait for that day to happen. In fact, you're kind of like locked up. So you're kind of like, man, I hope it happens while I'm in this place. And so, but what ended up happening, man, is I ended up getting out. And at that time, I would have been a senior, but I ended up getting my GED. I had the option to either study to when I got out to get my high school diploma or to get my GED. And I went the GED route. And, I got out. I was doing good for a little while. I was actually like reading my Bible and stuff. I went back to go live with my mom and my stepdad, and just kind of like working on like that relationship too. I had mentioned that, my stepdad was pretty strict when we were young. And before I got out of that program, he was actually coming to like meetings and stuff like that with my mom. And we would sit down, and we were just kind of getting me ready for the transition out to go back home. Because like I said, at that time, before that, I was living with my aunt. I was going to go back to my mom. So they took me back in. I was doing good for a little while, reading my Bible, trying to just stay focused. And I ended up getting a job. And so what ended up happening is I started hanging out with my old friends again. They were seniors that year, starting to go to parties. And I remember it just started off slow. It started off going to a party. I started like getting high again. In my mind, I was like trying to justify it like, oh, I'm sure God's okay with this. I'm not doing too much. Like I said, I really didn't have a whole lot of knowledge of the Bible or anything. Then it turned into like, oh, I'm able to smoke the whole joint now. I didn't mention this, but even when I was a teenager, when we were getting into weed and stuff like that, we were actually even experimenting with the harder drugs. We were experimenting with crystal meth and kind of doing some of the hard stuff. We would do shrooms and, acid, all that stuff. I mean, we're talking teenager, before even 10th grade, we're messing with these drugs. And so flash forward back to when I'm out, I'm starting to go to parties again, started messing around with the harder drugs again, started messing around, with crystal meth and the stuff that I had no business doing again. But I opened up that door. And at that time, I got involved in a relationship, and I was 18 years old, and I ended up having a son. So my ex from way back in the day or whatever, we ended up having a kid. And he was born, and I was working. Everything was going good. And then it was like tragedy struck in my life. He lived to almost 3 months old, and he ended up passing away. He died a sudden infant death. And it was a huge blow to me because he actually passed away like right next to me in the bed. Well, so I wake up, and, my girlfriend, I remember she was working late. I think she was working at Walgreens. And she ended up getting off work, coming home, and seeing that my son wasn't breathing, so I wake up in a panic, and he's still warm. I can touch his body. He's still warm, but he's not breathing, so, he ended up passing away, and that was a huge blow to me. I felt like it was my fault. I felt like it was the way that I was living, because even though I was working and I was trying to take care, my girlfriend and my son at the time, I was still getting high. My drug of choice was marijuana. And at that time, I was starting to get into producing music at the time. I just felt like it was personal. I felt like it was like God saying, I took your son because, the way you're living type kind of thing, So I kind of felt like it was a huge blow. I was not mad at God. I actually was turning to him and trying to reconnect with him. I was trying to, I knew it was a wake up call for me. And me and my girlfriend at the time, she ended up leaving me because, I was just wanted to party. I'd go to work and, the weekend would come around and I'd want to drink. And it was getting to the point where I couldn't handle drinking. I would end up acting a fool. People was always like, what's he going to do this time? Because I was notorious for just getting drunk and then just making a scene. It was getting pretty bad, and then I remember that time of my life, I felt this hole inside, and I knew that God was the way back. And I even tried like going to church once. And I remember like crying on the way to church, just, waking up from like partying the night before and then the way to church just crying. I knew that like God was the way, but I wouldn't last long. I would just go right back, eventually. And then, so me and my girl, we ended up splitting up. She couldn't deal with me anymore. I was just too much for her to handle, And I just remember I was working at this place and, they manufactured wheelchairs there and they hired me as the powder coater, So I'm sitting there working and I'm, going out with friends and partying and stuff like that. And I just remember praying to God and saying, God, I just pray that the next girl that you bring into my life, that she'll believe in you. Because I remember my ex at the time, she didn't have a faith, and I tried to get her to ask her if she would go to church, but she said, I'll go, but I'm not going to believe what you believe, type kind of thing. And so I remember that was one of the prayers I asked God because I was depressed. I was really depressed at that time because we had broken up and, I cared about her, you know what I mean? So it was a huge blow to me. And so I remember asking God, the next girl you bring into my life, I pray that she believe in you. And so I'm sitting here at work one day and my wife now ends up walking in, I'm like 19 years old. She comes walking in and I remember just like, wow, you know what I mean? I'm going to introduce myself. And I ended up finally getting the courage to introduce myself. And it turns out that she ended up losing her daughter and it had been recent. At that time I had lost my son for, maybe a year or something like that. But she had just recently lost her daughter to a birth defect, and, so we just connected, you know what I mean? It was like we had something in common and she had a faith. I remember her, telling me that she had just gotten saved, you know what I mean? She was really leaning on God. She was trying to get stronger with God. And, so we ended up, getting together. But what ended up happening, I was kind of dragging her backwards, because I was still in that lifestyle, drinking, partying. And I remember going to church. She would take me to church. And I just remember thinking like my heart just wasn't in it. You know what I mean? At that time, I was starting to make music and I had a whole different outlook on, I was trying to like blow up and, make it big and stuff like that. Me and my brother and stuff, we were recording in the studio and we were making, songs and we're like, yeah, we're going to blow up, you know what I mean? Type kind of thing. So when I would go to church, I'd just be thinking like, it's just not there. You know what I mean? My whole outlook was just like changing, on life. And it disappointed her. I remember she was just kind of like, trying to get me to like feel it. And I wouldn't, you know what I mean? Like I said, my whole outlook on life was just different. I didn't have, but at the same time, I still had that emptiness inside. And I was getting worse, I was doing, partying. And then it was like, I couldn't just drink, I would start getting into the hard drugs, it'd be like drinking and then have fun to do cocaine. We'd be up all night and we'd be, out at the clubs and I wasn't being faithful, to my girlfriend or, who's my wife now. At that time we were just dating, wasn't being faithful, so I was just a mess, man. And, so what ended up happening was it was 2003. I remember it was going to be for my 23rd birthday. I was planning, we're going to go out, we're going to party. We already had things set in motion. Me and my girlfriend, we're fighting at the time and she's actually pregnant with my son, who's actually, 21 now. She's pregnant with him. We're fighting. I'm like, no, I'm going out. She had something else planned for me. She wanted to do, something with us. And then she did not want me going out with my friends because she already knew what we were going to get into, so I ended up leaving and I tied one on for like 2 or 3 days. I was just drinking. And what ended up happening was, I was doing drugs. I was doing crystal meth. And I remember, I think it was right around day 3. I think I was coming down and I started getting anxiety attacks. And that was something that I didn't mention either before that experience, I remember I was starting to get anxiety attacks after I would drink. And then I would try to like go back to work. You know, that Monday would come around. I was drinking all weekend and then I would have an anxiety attack. And the first time I had one, I was like, whoa, what is this? You know what I mean? Felt like I was going to die. And it felt like God was like getting my attention with that, like saying, you know, you're on the edge. You know what I mean? And I remember started thinking a lot about life after death. I remember there would be times where I was going to go to the club, you know, and I'd be in the back of the car and I'd just be thinking like, what if this car turns over tonight? What if we die? Where am I going? And then that thought would just come to my mind, like, you're going to go to hell, dude. You know what I mean? Because the way you're living, you know, and it was just that realization, just like, wow. And then 9/11 happened. And I remember like that kind of freaked me out. I was like, man, we live in a world now where like people can just die. You know what I mean? Just no matter where you're at now, you know? So he was starting to like tug on my heart with certain things were happening. I just remember that like that transition taking place. And then that happened when I was 23. I'm sitting there partying, whatever. I'm doing drugs. And right around the second or third day, I ended up having an anxiety attack and it was pretty bad. And I remember looking up into the sky and I seen that it was like the sun was setting, the stars were starting to come out. And I remember thinking like, is there even a God? You know, and if there is a God, you don't want nothing to do with me. I remember having that realization. Like that's how far gone like my faith was. You know what I mean? Like I always believed in God, even since I was like a kid. There was always that thought in me, like he's real. And I remember even having conversations trying to defend God, you know, when I was like 18 years old and just throughout life, just always having that faith, like he's real. You know what I mean? But that's how far gone I was. I'm actually looking up and I'm like, man, is there even a God? And if there is, he don't want nothing to do with me. I ended up going to the hospital. Ambulance came. I'm freaking out. I'm thinking I'm going to die. They take me to the hospital. I end up spending the night there. The next day, I end up getting out and end up right back at the house that they picked me up from, which is my buddy's house. And so I'm sitting there in this chair, and I remember my buddy was in the room with his girlfriend. I'm sitting there in this chair, just up on myself, and I'm thinking to myself, like, I'm looking in the bathroom, and I see the shower curtain, and I get to thinking, like, what if I can make that shower curtain move? You know what I mean? Just on my own, just by concentrating. And so I'm looking at the shower curtain. All of a sudden, this is no joke, man. I seen that shower curtain move. And I said, whoa. I was like, man. So I'm thinking like, man, maybe I got like some kind of special power or something. Just, you know, just crazy thoughts. So then I'm thinking, you know, so then I look over at the couch and I see this hat sitting there on the couch, or it's just, there's a hat on the couch. And I remember looking at it. I'm like, what if I can make that hat move? And so I'm looking at this hat and all of a sudden I get it to like kind of make it move. And then I'm like, what if I can make that hat fly into my lap? And so I remember I put my hands out like this and I'm sitting there and I'm going like this, and this smoke ended up coming out of my fingertips and it's kind of cruising and it's going to the hat. And then all of a sudden it just starts going around the hat. And then all of a sudden, poof, this demon flies out. And this thing, he was flying in the air. And he looked kind of like cigarette smoke. That's kind of like, you know, like the color of it. But I remember it was making like this hideous noise, like this growling noise, you know. I knew it was evil, you know, and I was like, whoa. And then it dawned on me, this thing came out of me. That's what that smoke was. It was already in me, but it came out. And that's probably what was making things move. And so I freaked out because this thing, it was coming like towards me and I knew it wanted me. So then I was like, I'm out of here. So I left. And I remember I went across the street, went to the liquor store, hopped on a payphone. We didn't have, you know, this wasn't the smartphones back then. You know what I mean? We're talking 2003. So they were probably barely starting to come out. But so I'm sitting there on the payphone. I'm going to call my mom. And then all of a sudden I have this thought. Dude, you can't call your mom. Your mom's going to think you're nuts. You know what I mean? So I'm just like, click, hang up the phone. And I'm just sitting there thinking like, man, what am I going to do? So I was like, well, I'll just go back. So I end up going back, walk inside that apartment. No joke. That demon is still there, dude, waiting for me. Still just in the air. And I'm like, dang it. So finally, I'm just sitting there and I know he wants me, but it's like, I have nowhere to go. I was like, I'm not going to call my girlfriend. I didn't know who else to call. So I'm just like, I'm stuck with this thing. So I gave up and I said, whatever, do what you're going to do. So that thing came over to me and it went right into my arm. I remember it was my left arm. And when it went into my arm, it burned. It felt like somebody put a cigarette out on me and it actually made the noise that was like, and it burned. And so it went back into me. And so then it was like all these other like demonic spirits were just like starting to come out of like everywhere, you know, and they just wanted me. So then I'm sitting there and I'm wondering what the heck is going on. Why am I seeing all this stuff? You know what I mean? So then I look over at the wall, and I remember looking at the wall, and all of a sudden I see like this old lady's face appear in the wall, and she's whispering something to me. And I'm looking at her, and I'm like, what? And she's like, she was saying this. She was like, the other side. But I couldn't hear her voice. She was just mouthing it. And I said, what do you mean the other side? And she was like, they're here to take you to the other side. And then after that, my heart dropped. Then I got scared. I remember just hitting my knees right there, and I cried out to God, and I said, God, I said, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. And I cried out to God. I asked for forgiveness. And I remember after that, all of a sudden, it was like those spirits just started to like leave. It went from like a spiritual demonic vision to more like a trip. You know what I mean? Like when you take shrooms or acid or something. And then all of a sudden it just went away. It was gone. And so then I'm sitting there, my buddy's up, and there's other people starting to show up, you know, and they're just like, my buddy Troy, I remember him seeing me in that state. And he was just like, bro, he was like, you all right, man? And I was just like, dude, I was like, I was seeing demons, bro. And he was like, I know, man. He was like, you had us worried, man. And I was like, I'm good now. I was like, everything it's gone, you know? And he was like, cool. He's like, there's a beer in the fridge, man. Go get you a beer. So I go to the fridge, man, crack me a brew. And then he's like, dude, go get some rest, you know, because I'd been up for like 2-3 days, you know. And I ended up going into the room. Remember looking at the dresser, and there was a pipe on the dresser. And so then I end up picking it up, took a hit. After I took that hit, it was just like, I remember I had this thought, and I'm sitting there. I remember he didn't even have a bed, bro. It was just like a mattress. I'm just laying there. He had the walk-in closet, door was open. And I remember saying, looking in that closet, I remember saying, I see you in there. Why don't you come out? And then this is no joke, man. It was like a spirit just walked right out of that closet. It looked just like you and me. It looked like a human, but like you could see through it. And then I was just like, whoa, this is crazy, man. And you know, you're raised, you watch these movies about ghosts and stuff like that, but you're actually seeing this stuff. But the thing is like these spirits, they were like perverted. You know what I mean? Like they wanted to do sexual things, you know, because more of them started coming out. And they're starting to do, you know, like perversion things, you know what I mean? And I'm just sitting there just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is real. You know what I mean? Like, I can't believe I'm having this experience. So what ended up happening is one of my other friends, he ended up coming in. He was like, come on, bro. He's like, let's go. And I was like, where are we going? He was like, dude, he was like, so-and-so don't want you here anymore. He was like, let's roll. So I ended up leaving, and they took me to my other friend's house. And, you know, they ended up taking me in, and I'm up all night, and I'm seeing like all these spirits, you know what I mean, all night. And then they're asleep. They end up going to sleep. You know, they're in the other room, they're sleeping. I'm up by myself. And I just remember like some of these spirits were like telling me things like, kill yourself, come be with us type kind of stuff. And I kind of thought like it was a trap. You know what I mean? I remember thinking like, something don't seem right about that. They were able to like kind of manifest themselves as like women. At that time, I was 20? I was 23 years old. And so they were like kind of like my age looking, you know what I mean? And some of them almost looked pretty. And they're telling me things like, please kill yourself, you know what I mean? And I'm sitting there like, no, man, I ain't doing that. And so I remember looking over at this wall, and I know I'm getting into detail, man, but I'm sharing everything, you know what I mean, that I remember seeing that night, because it all ties in together. So I'm sitting up, you know, I'm communicating. I remember even one time I wanted to feel what they felt like. So I touched one of them, and it was like electricity. You know what I mean? I remember it was kind of like a static electricity when I touched one of them. I'm in the middle of the night. I'm up by myself, and I remember looking over at the wall like this. And in the wall, I seen who I thought was the devil. And he was just looking at me, and he had like a smile on his face. But I remember his head was just kind of like looking down, and he was just like an evil stare, bro. This is what he looked like. And to me, he kind of looked like a biker. You know what I mean? He almost looked like he had like leathers on, bro. And I ended up walking up to that wall, and I'm looking at him. And I remember looking at his face, and I remember seeing it was like a maggot crawled out of his nose and went into the other nostril. He just looked pure evil, man. And I knew that he knew something that I didn't know. He knew something that I didn't know. Like they were waiting. And there was like 2 other people that were with him, and they were evil. You know, they were just as evil as he was. And I remember that like they would taunt me. They would do things like I would look over, and then one would like pull out a shotgun, and he would just be like this, and he'd point at me. And to me, I'm really seeing this. So I'm like ducking, bro. Like I'm thinking I'm about to get blasted. You know what I mean? So I'm kind of freaking out, you know what I mean? And then then I realized, well, they're just toying with me. So I remember going back up to that wall and I'm sitting there and I'm looking, I'm talking to him, I'm asking him questions like, are you Satan? And he's pretty much looking at me, dude, and he's just like nodding. And so I was just like, okay. So then all of a sudden I said, I think I remember saying like, well, if you're Satan, then turn into something evil. And then all of a sudden it was like, there was this old movie when I was a kid and it was called Razorback. It was a horror movie. I think it had something to do with like, it was like this evil pig with horns or something like that. Cause I remember having the poster on my wall when I was a kid, but it's like he just went like that. And then all of a sudden it was just this evil looking creature, man, that was huge, bro. Almost, it was like the size of a buffalo. But I remember like the teeth were just super sharp and in its fur, dude, was just like, almost looked like human souls were in it. You know what I mean? Like it devoured souls, you know what I mean? And it was just grotesque looking, bro. And I was just like looking at this thing, like, I was just like, wow, man, this is nuts. You know what I mean? And I remember, like, so it could, if it, I think it was Satan, bro. He could turn into whatever, you know what I mean? Bible even says he can turn into an angel, disguise himself as an angel's light. It was turned into like different figures. I was one of them. I just remember just being kind of tripped out. You know what I mean? Like, I can't believe I'm seeing this stuff, man. This is incredible. And it was almost like, but I wasn't real fearful. You know what I mean? I was just like taking it all in. You know what I mean? And at one point he turned into this dragon, and he was like in the popcorn silly, but he was like in it. I mean, just like an evil looking dragon. And I just remember looking up at him and he was just toying with me, the whole night. He was just like making me, just think weird sayings, like I'm going to devour you type kind of stuff. You know what I mean? And so that night played on all night. Finally, the morning comes. I'm still up. You know what I mean? I'm still seeing all this stuff. And my buddy ends up getting up and he sees that I'm still up and I'm seeing, just kept telling him, dude, I'm seeing demons, bro. And so my identical twin brother was like, he was in a different apartment, just like down the hall. He was in another different apartment at my other friend's house. So my buddy ends up going over there and he ends up getting my brother. My brother comes over and he sees the condition that I'm in. And so he gets worried. And one of the other things that I remember is before my brother came was I remember I was looking at the carpet and there was these demonic figures that were in the carpet and they were looking at me. And all of a sudden I remember this thing flew out of the carpet and it flew into my arm. And this thing was like, it was crawling up. I remember it was crawling up my arm on the inside of my arm, like it was in a vein or something. And I remember I got scared. That was like the first time this whole experience where I was actually, I felt like I was like something was going to happen, like I was going to die. Like whatever flew into my arm, which was demonic, was working its way up. And the closer I remember it got up, I remember it was like my heart would beat faster. The more it moved up my arm, my heart would beat faster. So I was like, this thing's trying to kill me. And so I remember squeezing my arm like this, trying to keep it from moving up in my arm. And so then I knew, because the demonic realm is, they're deceiving. They almost had me convinced that they were on my side almost. And then all of a sudden, just like that, they turned on me. And I was just like, no, man, they're trying to kill me. So I remember I'm holding my arm. They end up getting me over to, my brother. My brother's just like, he's flipping out. He's never seen me in that state before. You know what I mean? And so he ends up calling the cops, so the cops show up, I'm sitting there, I'm holding my arm, I'm like, this thing can't reach my heart. I'm going to die, The cop ends up showing up and he's like, you know what? He was like, just calm down. He's like, we're just here to help you. He's like, we're not going to arrest you. They're like, what's going on? I don't remember what I told him, but they're like, all right, come with us. Put the cuffs on me just to make sure, everything was cool. And I remember I'm sitting there in the back of this in this cop car and they're driving me down Swedish Medical Center, Denver. They end up taking me there. And I remember going inside the hospital. I was in the hospital room. And I remember they had IVs and stuff in me. You know what I mean? They're trying to, I think, just get me hydrated and they're trying to get me, flushed out, I think is what it was. So I'm sitting there in this hospital room and all of a sudden, like these spirits are just like everywhere in the room. I mean, they're just like, just everywhere. You know what I mean? And I'm just like, man, I'm kind of overwhelmed by it. I'm just like, man, I just can't take this anymore. You know what I mean? And I remember just like looking up and these spirits, they went like this. He just took off. And I was like, what the heck? I was like, where'd they go? And all of a sudden I look up and all of a sudden Jesus is coming down and he's flying down and I could see and he's kind of just coming down real slow. You know what I mean? And I remember he was gold. And I remember looking up at him and it dawned on me, those demons took off, those spirits took off because he showed up. And so I'm sitting here in that hospital bed and I'm looking up. And I remember two, I don't know if they were angels. I don't know if they were like apostles or what, but they were okay. So let me back up just a little bit. When Jesus came, he was like maybe the size of my hand, but he was like up towards the ceiling. And I remember he was probably about maybe 15 feet, you know what I mean, away from me, but like diagonal and up. So I was looking at him like this, but then two of angels or whatever they were, they come down and they're gold, and I can kind of see through them, but they're gold. You know what I mean? I remember the demonic spirits and everything that I was seeing. They were like the color of like cigarette smoke. And so the one comes to my left-hand side and one comes to the right-hand side of my bed. And they're kneeling down like on one knee. And they're kind of just like looking at me. So I remember looking to the one on my left. And I remember I was telling him, I'm sorry for the way I was living, you know, this and that. I'm like giving him a whole spiel. And I remember he looked at me and he didn't talk to me. He just looked at me and he went, and they were both going like this. You know what I mean? They were like, I knew what they were throwing down. They were saying, don't tell us that, tell him that, you know? So then I focused my attention back to Jesus and I just started pleading. I said, Lord, I'm sorry, Lord, for the way I've been living, you know, this and that. And I'm just giving him a whole spill. You know that we grew up kind of rough, you know, this. And, you know, I'm like, I'm telling him that I'm sorry, you know, but I remember the Lord, he just kept looking at me and he kept going like this. You know, he was just going like that with his finger. And so he just wasn't hearing anything that I was telling him, you know what I mean? And so I just remember asking him, I said, Lord, does this mean that I'm going to be, you know, separated from you? And I remember he was just like, you know, like nod his head, yes. And then, and I was like, well, if I'm going to be separated from you, does that mean that I'm going to hell? And he was just like, you know, he was just like telling me yes. And then I remember at one point, I'll never forget this. He looked like he grabbed a lever and then he just pulled it down like this. And it was almost like he was telling me, you're done, you know what I mean? Type kind of thing. Because what was crazy is it felt like there was like an elevator door behind me. And it felt like at any moment I was just going to be pushed in the back of this elevator and the doors were going to shut and I was just going to get lowered down into hell. That's what it felt like. And so I'm having like this probably close to death experience. You know what I mean? This was the only way that he was going to get my attention because my mom couldn't get my attention. My aunt, you know, nobody could really get through to me at that time, you know? So I'm having this experience. So then I accept it and I'm like, okay. I was like, well, I guess it just is what it is then, you know what I mean? And so the Lord, I remember he left on a spiral staircase. He walked up that spiral staircase slow. And I just remember just feeling guilt. And I remember feeling like I wasted my life. You know what I mean? Like now I'm going to die. I'm sitting here. The Lord's already, you know, pretty much said, that's it. You're done. And he didn't talk to me with words, but it was just like with hand gestures and stuff and yes or no. And so I accepted it. I was like, man, I'm going to hell. So then these spirits, they come back up. These spirits, they looked kind of just like you and me. At that time, I'm 23 years old. So some of them kind of looked like street thugs, you know, they had clothes on. Some of them are even smoking cigarettes. And I'm just tripping out. I'm just like, and they're telling me things like, man, you mind when you get down there. You know what I mean? And I'm just like, well, to me, I'm trying to act tough because it felt like I was going to prison. And I was like, I can't punk down. You know what I mean? I got to act tough because if I get down there and I'm weak, they're going to roll me up. That's what it felt like. It felt like I was going to prison because I went to the Scared Straights programs. I've been inside prisons, you know, where they take you to the cell blocks and the inmates scare you and all that. You know what I mean? So that's what it felt like, man. These guys were acting like they were, you know, straight, you know, but they were demonic. They were demons, bro, just disguised. And so I'm laying there in the hospital bed. They're feeding me all this stuff. They're messing with me. I remember hearing like, it was like the doctor was outside talking to like family members that weren't even there. And it was like the doctor was pretty much telling him like, you know, this is it for Artie. You know, he's done. It was almost like the doctor was even telling him like, you know, Jesus said no type kind of thing, you know, and, you know, he's going to die, you know, so go ahead and go in there and say your goodbyes. You know, this is it. My mom wasn't there. And it was like my twin brother was there. I could hear them, but they really weren't there. But it was almost like God was letting me feel like what it feels like for somebody who's going to die when their loved ones go to say goodbye to them. So I heard them walking in the hospital room and I closed my eyes and I laid back in the bed. I couldn't even face them. So I kept my eyes shut. I didn't even peek or nothing, but it was like I heard them walk up around me. And I remember telling my brother, I said, Chris, I was like, I'm sorry, dude, for the way I'm sorry, bro. I'm sorry, dude. And he was just like, man, he was just like, forget you, man. He was like, I don't even want to hear it. He was just like disappointed in me. I remember my aunt saying, well, you just make sure you do good, Chris. You know what I mean? So that way you're not end up like him. So then they left. Then I opened my eyes up and I'm laying there. I'm feeling guilty. I'm feeling like I wasted my whole life. And then all of a sudden I heard this voice and it said, man, I think Jesus is going to give him another chance. And I heard it. And I said, in my mind, I was like, what does that mean? So then all of a sudden I look up and that same spiral staircase is there again. And this time Jesus is coming down. And this time he's talking to me and I can hear him this time. And he's saying, Artie. And I'm laying there and I'm ignoring him. I don't want to talk to him no more because I'm afraid of him. And I'm like, I just don't want to hear any bad news anymore. I've already accepted it, you know? And he's saying, I know you could hear me. Quit ignoring me. I know you could hear me. And so I finally remember I just looked up at him and I said, Lord, please, Lord, give me one more chance. And with frustration in his voice, I remember he kind of like turned away and he was like, all right, just like that. And it sounded just like how like my dad would tell me or any family figure, you know what I mean? Like an uncle or dad, it sounded just like that, you know, but with frustration in his voice. It was almost like he was like, I'm going to forgive you, but I can't believe I'm doing this type kind of thing. That's kind of what it sounded like. The whole time that I'm looking at Jesus, you know, when I'm seeing him, not even one time does it even come across my mind. This is the person who went to the cross for me. This is the person who died for my sins. You know what I mean? That's how far gone I was, man. I knew he was the judge. When I say judge, I mean like he was the boss. You know what I mean? He was the one who has the final say so where you're going. Didn't have really any Bible knowledge. I knew he was coming back one day, but as far as anything else, I just didn't have a whole lot of knowledge. So he forgives me. His peace comes upon me. And I remember there was one time where I was just laying there in that hospital bed and these little tiny balls of light were falling down. And they were I remember just looking at them and they were coming down and they were just landing on me. And I was just like, what is that all about? Didn't know what that was. But I remember the Lord had forgiven me. His peace came upon me. And those demonic spirits, they came back up and they were like telling me things like they were mad, dude. They were real mad. They were like, oh, you'll be back. But here's the thing I remember too. When I go back into this testimony, things, you know, they come back to, you know, where I can remember them and stuff. But I remember them saying like, oh, he'll be back. But when I talked to Jesus, I didn't even have to talk with my mouth. You know what I mean? I was able, it was like my spirit, man, you know, the voice inside you, that's out in the open. Even the demons can hear that stuff and they use that against you. Because if you think anything bad, they're like, oh, what was that? You know what I mean? Did you just hear what he said? Because it's like, you know, sometimes when you think negative things, they come out as a voice. Well, they can hear that and Jesus can hear it too. And so I was just thinking like, if I accidentally thought something, it was out in the open, man. It was like loud, you know, did you hear what he just said? Did you just hear what he said? And I'm thinking like the Lord is going to change his mind. You know what I mean? Because it was like wicked thoughts would pop in my mind, like even towards the Lord. You know what I mean? And I'm just like, Lord, I didn't mean that. I was like, that was a thought. You know what I mean? And so I'm thinking like, man, dude, like I got to be 100%, can't mess up at all. Otherwise the Lord's he's going to change his mind on me. You know what I mean? And so I'm sitting in there and the doctor comes in. He starts talking to me and he's saying, well, you know, Mr. Mays, you know, you were here yesterday. And I was, because remember, I told you I had that anxiety attack. I was there the day before, you know, so he was like, you were just here yesterday. He was like, you got a lot of stuff in your system. You know what I mean? He's like, and you're racking up quite a hospital bill. He's like, what are you going to do to pay this stuff back? He's asking me these questions. Then he's asking me like, what are you going to do different with your life? You got a problem. You got a serious problem. You know, he's telling me. And I'm sitting there telling him, well, I'm going to go get a job. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. But there was it was kind of like a crow pillar that was like in the room, like in the corner or something, or in the drywall. And I could see the Lord's face in there. And this time his face wasn't gold. It was like I could see his color, you know, like he was dark complected. His teeth were real white. His hair was like straight down to his shoulders. But it was kind of a little bit contorted a little bit because he was in a chrome siding or something. And he just kept saying his name over again. And he kept saying, Jesus, Jesus. So I'm talking to this doctor. I'm giving him the whole spiel on what I'm going to do different with my life. And all of a sudden I look over. I'm like this. I'm like, what, Lord? What? And then he says his name again. And I look over at this doctor and I said, Jesus, I said, that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, bro. And that doctor's sitting there, he's taking notes, right? And he kind of just looked at me and he was like, wrote it down or whatever, kind of smirked, he's like, this dude's tripping, And so he ends up leaving. I'm being tormented, by these demonic, spirits that are in the room. They just won't leave me alone. They're mad, they're I know they're upset because they knew that they were this close to having me, and they knew that Jesus forgave me. And so they're mad, they're like, we almost had him. And so I remember after that happened, I remember I had to go use the bathroom, and I ended up going in the bathroom and stuff. I remember seeing this angel kind of like in front of me. It was small. It was only like this big, and it looked like it picked up like a long, kind of like glass of water, I thought it was. And the angel went like this. And I said, yeah, I know I need to get some water. And the angel, and then I remember seeing like footprints. And then all of a sudden I put two and two together. And it was like that angel was telling me, you're going to walk the walk until the trumpet's blown. That thing wasn't a glass of water. It was one of those long trumpets, because it picked it up and it went like this, like it was blowing it. And so I gathered that angel was telling me, you're going to walk the walk until the trumpet's blown. And that was one thing that rung out that always stuck with me even to this day. Like I said, I've always been fascinated with, Jesus is coming back one day. And I remember walking out of that bathroom and I was just like, what the heck? And I remember all of a sudden, like, the Lord was small again, you know what I mean? And he was like, kind of like going next to me. And I remember him saying, he's like, all right, Art, just like that. And it was just like, the way he said it though was just kind of like, give you another chance. Let's, don't let me down, type kind of thing. All right, Art. I said, all right, Lord. Went back into the room, sat there, looked over at the wall. Now I could see the Lord, and he's like in a different place. This time he's not gold. This time I could see him in full color. White robe, blue sash over that white robe, brown hair. I could see his complexion, everything. But this time, and I know it sounds crazy, but this is what I seen, man. This is what I seen. He was on a beach, and he was with the tribe, and they looked like they were like an Indian tribe. I don't know what they were, but I remember looking over and there was an ocean, and there was a whale that was washed up on the ocean shore, and the whale was just flapping. It was a big giant. It was like what's the biggest whale? Like, what is it? Those, I don't know if it's a killer whale or whatever. It was a big whale, dude. It's washed up like black and white, huge, flat, splashing its tail in the ocean. And that whale had a smile on its face. I'm sitting there and I'm just like, what the heck is going on here? And I'm seeing the Lord, and he's with this tribe. When me and my brother were kids, we were always fascinated with like martial arts and stuff. And I look over at the Lord, and I'm not joking. I know it sounds wild and it's weird even, maybe to some people, but the Lord, he had like this staff in his arm, and he's doing like martial arts with this tribe out there on the beach. And I ain't never seen this kind of martial arts before. I've seen a lot of movies, seen all the Van Dammes, all the, you know what I'm saying? The Bruce Lees, all that stuff. Jackie Chan, dude, what he was doing with this staff, dude, I've never seen it. Never seen it. Not on this earth. I haven't seen it. And I was blown away. I was like, oh my gosh, man. Like, Jesus is cool, man. Like you know what I mean? Like, you think he's just up there in heaven, just sitting down on this throne? I mean, he does that too, but Jesus can do all things. You know what I mean? I was just blown. I remember, like, he showed me that. And if I could say where that was at, I don't know where it was at, but I would say maybe the 1,000-year reign. I don't know. I know that one day he's coming back. He's gonna set up his kingdom on this earth, and we're gonna reign for 1,000 years, with him. And so that's kind of what I think he was showing me, like. And so what ended up happening is I ended up seeing, he was showing me things like that. And I remember just like I remember I finally started getting tired. And I remember even my mom called the hospital. They got a hold of my mom. I'm on the phone with my mom, and my mom's just telling me, like, what the heck's going on? And I'm like, Mom, I was like, I just seen Jesus. I was like, Jesus just gave me another chance. And my mom's telling me, like, you better get your stuff together, boy. You know what I mean? She's like, you're out of control, telling me stuff like that. And I just remember I just kept telling her, like, Mom, it's going to be all right. I was like, Mom, Jesus, I seen Jesus. He gave me another chance. Everything's going to be fine. You know what I mean? And so I remember having that conversation with her the next day. And it was really her. You know what I mean? This wasn't like, You know, like they actually gave me the phone. I remember they called me out. They said, your mom's on the phone. And so the next day I wake up and I'm in a psych ward. They ended up, admitted me from where I was at before to the actual psych ward. And I remember waking up because the nurse came in and she's like bringing in breakfast, you know, a tray. And she's like, yeah, why don't you go ahead and get up and, you know, eat breakfast. And, you know, we're going to have some arts and crafts, you know, over in that other room. And I was just like, and she ended up leaving and my clothes are all folded up on the chair and stuff. And I ended up getting up. As soon as she left, I remember I just crawled out of that hospital bed and I hit my knees right there, man. And I lifted my hands up and I said, Jesus. I said, Lord. I was like, I remember everything that I seen yesterday. I remember what you told me. And I was like, and I'm serious, Lord. I was like, I'm yours. And I think I hopped back in the bed and I went to sleep. And then so what ended up happening is, my wife now, you know, girlfriend at the time, pregnant with my son, ends up going to the hospital while I'm there. Their role is like, we got to keep you for 72 hours. I'm telling the whoever's there, I'm like, no, man, I need to get out for church, dude. Sunday's right around the corner. You know what I mean? And he was like, no, you got to be here the full 72 hours. And I remember he ended up walking by my room again and he peeked his head and he's like, you know what, Art? He's like, make sure I get you out for church, man. And I was like, right on, bro. So it was like God was already starting to like answer prayers, right? My girlfriend ends up coming to see me. I'm telling you, remember, we were in a fight. We were like, you know, she was mad at me because I was out there just acting a fool, you know what I mean? And she comes in and she hasn't talked to me in like a few days. And she comes in and I'm telling her, babe, I see Jesus. I was like, I'm serious. Like, I'm done. I'm done with that lifestyle. I'm done with everything, you know? She's looking at me like I lost my mind. You know, she's looking at me like this dude's nuts, man. Like, what the heck? And I remember I didn't. So here's what happened. When I was out there partying and doing all that, my wife ended up going into the bathroom and she ended up crying out to God. And she said, God, I cannot do it anymore. She was just like in tears, like he's yours. You know what I mean? I just can't do it anymore. She cried out to God. So that when she's at the hospital with me, I'm telling her what happened, my experience, and I tell her everything. She ends up believing and she's thinking that I'm crazy. And she said that God spoke to her in her heart firmly and says, well, you don't think I can't do that? And she was like, checked. And she was like, well, no, I think you can do that. You know what I mean? So God was just like, well, you don't think I could change a person like that? And so my wife was real iffy. I ended up going back, you know, home with her. But here's the kicker, man. Like, I remember walking out of that hospital. And when I walked outside, you know, keep in mind, no more visions. The visions are gone. Visions are gone. I'm like, right. I'm back in my right mind again. Right. I walk outside and I remember just like looking at the sky. It was like summer. And I remember looking up and I just remembered like, oh my gosh, what is this place? You know what I mean? Like the grass was greener. The trees were like happy. You know, it was like, everything was just vibrant, man. It was almost like God. It was almost like I had scales on my eyes, man, my whole life. You know what I mean? And God finally took the scales off and I was actually seeing his creation, what he made. And I just remember just feeling like love, man. I felt like I started listening to like Christian music and like the hair on my arms would stand up and I started actually feeling like the presence of the Holy Spirit, you know, come on me. And I was just hungry, man. I was just so hungry. I was like, I remember even telling friends, I was like, dude, I seen Jesus. And they're just like, well, what do you mean? I was like, I seen Jesus, bro. I'm done with that life. I quit cussing. I cuss with the best of them. You know what I mean? Quit doing that. It was just like I said, I had this in my mind that if I do anything wrong, Jesus is going to change his mind and I'm going right back to where I was headed. Right. And I remember my girlfriend would come home at the time. I had nowhere else to go. You know, so I was living with her. And I remember she would come home and I'd be in my Bible. She'd come home and I'd have Christian television on. And I was just hungry, man. I was just devouring the word, like getting knowledge of who this Jesus was. You know what I mean? Like, man, he went to the cross for me. Like, I'm getting hungry. I'm on fire, going through this period where my thoughts are tormented still, because I know that the spiritual realm could hear, you know, when I was in that state, they could hear all my thoughts. And if I thought anything bad, it was out in the open and they would like, oh, did you just hear what he said? And Jesus could hear that too. He can hear your thoughts. Cause I remember sitting, I was in that hospital room and I was having like these thoughts would just shoot out, bam, bam, bam. They would be negative thoughts. And one time the Lord looked at me. You know what I mean? And he was like, where that other dimension that I see in him, where it was like he was in 1,000-year reign. Shut up. He told me that, bro. I remember he told me that. So Jesus can hear your thoughts, dude, from afar off. We already know that's in the Word of God, right? In the book of Psalms, you hear my thoughts from afar off, Lord. You know my sitting down and my rising up. He knows even things before we even do it. So I'm going through this period of time after this happens for a full year where I'm having really bad thoughts. And they would just be like demonic thoughts, evil thoughts about God. And it would tear me up, man. I was going through days where I was just overwhelmed and I was tired. And I remember telling my wife, I said, we're done. I was like, I can't sleep in the room with you no more. I'm going to sleep out there on the couch until we get married. I was like, we got to do things right. And so we ended up getting married. We got married and I was struggling. I was trying to get a job. I'm going through these battles in my mind. I kept thinking I'm going to lose what Jesus gave me. I'm going to church. And my wife just knew that like the change was happening, man, because we'd go to church and she ain't never seen me go like this, man. Praise Jesus, bro. And I'm there at church, man. I'm praising Jesus. I can't get enough of God. And I'm just on fire. I ended up getting a job. I started seeing God like come through, and it was like things didn't come right away. Like I really had to believe him for that job. It was like he was starting me ground zero all over again. And I'm going to work, and I'm telling kids about Jesus. You know what I mean? I'd be on the bus and I would just be like, hey man, I'd be like, you know, you ever heard about Jesus? Hey man, he wants to save you. You know what I mean? I was just witnessing, telling people about Jesus. The kid on the bus was like, I was like, do you want to pray? I was like, you can receive him right now. And he was like, no, man, I'm cool. And I was like, all right, cool. So I'm just sitting there on the bus and all of a sudden he looks over at me. He's like, all right, let's do it. So then I'm like, all right, let's do it, man. So I lead him in the sinner's prayer on the bus. I'm at work, man. I'm saving people, leading people to Jesus at work, man. It was like God was just doing things. You know what I mean? I remember there was a kid at King Soopers. He was just real like to himself. You know what I mean? I ended up telling him about the Lord. And it was just like, I would get these packets from church, you know, these beginner packets, like with the Bible and, you know, what to do after salvation. And, you know, say if they accepted the Lord, I'd give them that packet. I'd be like, here's this packet, bro. You know what I mean? And then I'd touch base with them. And after about a month, be like, hey man, did you end up checking out that packet? It had like a New Testament Bible in there. He's like, oh yeah, man, I read it already. He's like, I'm going to it again, you know? So it was just like, God was just doing things, man. I was on fire. I was going to quit music altogether, you know, at the beginning, but then the Lord spoke to me and he said, no, he's like, I gave you that gift for a reason. You know what I mean? He's like, I want you to use it for me, you know? So then I started doing Christian music and started just turning my whole thing around, you know, because before it was like trying to blow up and make it big. Now it's for Jesus, man. It's telling people about it. And, you know, so that's what happened. You know, like I said, I told you that, you know, I had a identical twin brother, and there would be times where like he would like get on board and he would like start walking the walk, but then, you know, something would happen where he would just get, you know, drugged backwards and end up going, you know, the opposite way. And that was pretty much the whole story with me and him and our relationship, you know, from age 23, you know, I'm 44 now. And the unfortunate news about my identical twin brother is the Bible says that the wages of sin is death, and eventually death will come. You know what I mean? If you continue to live in that lifestyle. And my brother ended up passing away. You know, he died not this last July that just passed, but the July before he ended up passing away. But here's the thing about him. We would have many conversations, and I would always try to point him back to Jesus every single time. Like, Chris, you know that you know Jesus is the way, man, and you know the way that you're living is keeping us, you know, from having a relationship. And he would know that. There'd be times where he just wouldn't even call me, you know. But then, so he was like in and out of jail all the time. And then one of the last times that he got out of jail, and it was one of my worst fears, man, was my twin brother losing him. And I end up coming home from work and I get a phone call, and my auntie saying that your brother, you know, is at Denver Health. You know what I mean? He's in a coma. And my heart just dropped, man, because I was like, man, I knew it, man. I knew something was going to eventually happen. And so what ended up happening is they found him out in the field in Denver, and he barely had a pulse. Okay. So they ended up starting his heart. they were taking him to the hospital. His heart, they ended up starting his heart again, but then they lost him again. So they're doing CPR on him, trying to bring him back. Right. And after they said they did like, I think it was like three cycles on him or something, equivalent to a half hour of CPR on him. Finally got his heart started again. His heart ends up starting again, but he's in the coma, right? Because he ended up suffering brain injury from the lack of oxygen to the brain. And I'm sitting there and I'm just like, devastated, and we're there. And so this was like one of the dark storms that I had to go, through in my life. And I held on to him. We held on to him because my hope was that Jesus was going to heal him and that he was going to come back, And so we held on to him for almost a whole year. And there was times where we thought he was going to bounce back, because he got to the point to where, he can open up his eyes and, he'd look around, but he could never do anything on his own. I could never say, Chris, look at follow my finger this way or that way. He could never do that. It was just like wherever he was looking. And he just went through this horrible time, you know what I mean? But I think, and this is what I believe, is that had my brother died that day, he would have had no chance. There would have been no chance for him. But I believe that the Lord in his grace allowed his heart to get started again, because from the research that I've done, that people that have these, suffer these brain injuries, because some people have made it out of them, and they come back saying, no, I was there. I could hear the doctors. I could hear everything. I just couldn't communicate with you guys. My brother had a trach in his throat, so the vocal cords, weren't even connected. And so I believe that the Lord in his grace allowed his heart to get started again, but that was going to be it. It's like, this is it. You know what I mean? Like, you're going to be in this hospital bed now. And the only way you can communicate to me is through prayer. And I believe that the Lord gave him a year to cry out to him and to get ready for, you know what I mean? Pretty much, the Lord already knew what was going to happen. I was hoping that he was going to get healed, but that never happened. You know what I mean? But I would go visit him. It was a weekly thing. My wife would go visit him during the day, like during the week. And then I would go visit him. Sunday was my day where I would go and visit him. And I would just sit there with him, man, and I would hold his hands, and his eyes would be open. And I would just tell him, Chris, you know what I mean? Like, Jesus loves you, bro. And if I know my brother, I know he was already crying out to Jesus. I know that he was probably guilty, saying like, Lord, please, save me. And so we had a whole year with him, to, talk with him. And finally his health just declined. And I just knew, I knew it was time. And his feeding tube ended up coming out of his stomach. After we had admitted him to hospice, the feeding tube came out. That was a decision I was going to have to make, but it was almost like God allowed that to happen to where I didn't have to make that decision. And so after his feeding tube came out, he lasted 2 more days and then he finally passed. And so that was definitely a trial that I went through to where I myself felt like I was going to lose it, because like I said, that's my identical twin brother, man. We was, best friends as kids, I went through my thing. We got in trouble. I remember I ended up going to the drug rehab program. He ended up going to ROP, Rites of Passage. He was in Nevada. I'm over here doing my thing. He ended up getting out. We got out kind of at the same time, and we were just tight. But then once I got saved, once I gave my heart to Jesus, it was kind of like there was always that thing in between us. And it was like he knew that we could. And I would always tell him, Chris, all you got to do is just follow Jesus, man. I was like, we can have this relationship, And he, but it just caught up with him. That was that, But I believe he's home. I believe he's up there, God in his grace. I believe that the Lord gave him that time.
Man, what a story. The whole time I'm listening to you, I totally forgot that I'm interviewing you.
Yeah.
I just got so caught up in the story that, I felt like I was right there with you with the story. And I'm so sorry to hear you lost your brother. It hits hard for me because I'm also a twin. I have an identical twin brother.
Right.
And he's probably the better half. He's a saint. He's a good guy. Yeah. And so for me, just
now he's seeing everything. He's seeing everything that we talked about. I mean, there'd be times, he was my brother though. It was like he was like the weaker vessel. You know what I mean? It was just he had a hard time with temptation. My brother was the type to where like he would get out, start doing good, and all it would take would be like maybe somebody from work say, "Hey, bro, let's go to the bar." My brother would just cave. You know what I mean? He didn't have that. But I also had a serious experience with Jesus, to where God had to put the fear in my heart to fear him, because the way that I was living before, I didn't have that fear of God. But once I came face to face with him like that, I knew that he was the one. The word of God says that Jesus has the keys to life and death. You know what I mean? You're the one that you're going to face him one of these days. You know, that's something that we're all going to go through. And so, yeah.
There's so many follow-up questions here, man. I've got a page. I'm interested in a lot of different things. So, for example, you said you were awake for 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
You think that contributed to, you know, I can't remember somebody mentioning in the past that when you stay awake for that long, it almost like the spiritual world opens up to you, right? It's almost like if you fast for a certain amount of time,
yep,
you start seeing things. Do you think that, I'm sure you were doing drugs and all those other things as well.
Yeah.
But do you think lack of sleep contributed?
Oh, for sure. But I also believe that God used that to open up. I mean, the door was open. The way that I was living, that door was open.
And another thing, these demons that you said that were coming in and out of you.
Yeah.
How do you think they got into your body to begin with, in your temple? So
the way I was living, the drugs. Yep.
Do you think drugs, alcohol, all that stuff is
all that stuff?
Gateway is it's like a gateway to.
It is. It is. That's why people, you know, they say, yeah, but it's just marijuana. Well, it's a stepping stone, man. It's not for us. You know what I mean? The word of God says for us to have, you know, a sober mind, you know, before the Lord your God, you know, to be in your right mind. And marijuana doesn't do that. You think different things, you know what I mean? You think crazy thoughts. And all it is, it's just a doorway, you know. And so, yeah, I'd say 100% that lifestyle, you know, you're filling yourself with that demonic realm.
What about alcohol, for example? Like a lot of Christians, especially in this country, it's like alcohol, you know, beer, wine. It's like it's the norm. Yeah. But anything harder than that is like, oh, that's bad. What do you say to that?
I lean on the scriptures for that, and Jesus says that drunkards will not inherit the kingdom of God. So if that alcohol has become something in your life to where it's no longer like a social thing, you know, a wedding or a celebration, wedding anniversary, those types of things. If you're getting drunk and you got a problem, then yeah, it's become something in your life to where that's an open door. I mean, Jesus, you know, he turned, you know, water into wine. You know, I'm sure he celebrated a little bit, you know what I mean? But it was never, you know, to be taken out of control to where it controls your life. And for me, that's what it was doing at that time.
But I guess you can see, I guess you can say the same thing about food, right? For some people.
Oh, yeah.
It's their alcohol as well, right? Some people overindulge and hurt their temple. It becomes an addiction to it as well.
Exactly.
Another thing, you mentioned that Jesus appeared to you and he was small, very small, right?
Yep.
The size of your hand.
Yeah.
Why do you think he appeared to you that way?
I think he appeared to me that way because that's how small he was to me in my life at that time. And it might even been to where I couldn't handle him full size like that. I probably wouldn't be able to last in that kind of presence, you know? So I think there's a reason behind everything, but I think that was definitely one of the reasons because there wasn't a thought that entered my mind the whole time I'm looking at him that, hey man, he went to the cross for you. You know what I mean? He died for you. Like that means something to me now. You know, that is, you know, what my whole life is based off of now, you know, is what he did for us on that cross. That's everything. Power of the cross, man. It's, you know, life and death. Jesus did it all for us on that cross. You know, it's foolishness. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it's the power of God. You know, there's power in that cross to me now, and I'll never forget it. Never.
You mentioned that you have kids, that you're a family man. Do they know this story, and what do they think about this?
They've heard it plenty of times because, like I said, I've gotten to use my music as a ministering tool. So I've been on stage plenty of times, gotten to go in a couple jails, you know what I mean, when I was in my 20s and minister through the music. And I always share my testimony. That's one thing that I always share. So they've heard it. They've heard it a lot of times. And, you know, and it's kind of like my wife, she's heard it so many times, you know what I mean? But God has given me dreams. I mean, one of the dreams that the Lord gave me after I got saved was, I remember I had this dream where I was doing crazy stuff in my dream, man. I was throwing like big old trucks at other trucks, and I was like this superhero or something. And I heard the Lord laugh. He laughed. He like chuckled. And then he said, just do my will, you know? And then I woke up, and then I had another dream where the Lord told me, he said, I want you to take my message to the oceans. And I said, and I couldn't see him, but I could hear him like up there. And I said, Lord, I was like, when I get to the oceans, do I stop? And then I heard two voices at once. No. And then I woke up, and then I had another dream where the Lord told me, I said, Lord, I said, are you coming back soon? And then there was a pause, and then I heard, believe soon. And then I woke up. Bam. So he didn't just tell me soon. He said, believe soon. That's the whole thing with God, with Jesus, is our faith. He wants us to believe. You know what I mean? Believe he's coming soon. All you have to do is look around.
Why do you think he said, believe I'm coming soon, not yes, I'm coming soon?
Because faith, we have to believe. He wants us to be in that. Because if we don't believe he's coming soon, we get sluggish. We start to fall back. But if the one who's believing that he's coming soon is going to live a different way than the other person who thinks, he's coming in another 50 years. I can kind of do what I want, wait till that time gets close, and then maybe live the way I'm supposed to live.
You know, you mentioned during the interview, you mentioned that, I think you just briefly mentioned the fear of God. Do you think it's something that's absent from today or among a lot of Christians?
Absolutely. When I was living that way, you know what I mean? It's like I said, it started off as a slow fade. When I got out of the program, I was doing good for a little while in my own eyes, reading my Bible. Didn't really understand what I was reading, but I thought I was doing okay, you know, and then it was just a little hit there, then half a joint here, then a whole joint. And then next thing you know, now I'm doing, you know, the hard drugs. It's a slow fade, you know what I mean? But it was because I had a little bit of fear, but then you sear your conscience. And then after that's seared, then that's it. You don't fear God anymore, and you're living the way that you want to live, you know, and eventually it's going to catch up with you.
You know, it's interesting. In entrepreneurial circles, there's this quote which says, you don't always get your goals, but you always get your standard. And a lot of Christians feel like the standard is very low, but they're striving for better things. But every time, you know, you don't always get your goals, but you always default to your standard. So what I'm hearing is you got to raise your standard, right? And you got to live up to your standard. Well, man, I know it's been such a long time you shared this testimony. It was amazing, man. I just want to say a huge thank you for sharing your testimony, your story. And man, a lot of people are going to hear it. So I just want to say a huge thank you. And man, we're going to have to do a part 2.
I know, man. Yeah. Just kind of briefly touching on, you know, so what ended up happening is, you know, I got saved. Me and my wife, we got married. We had my son. The Lord opened up, you know, employment for me. He started me off small, man. I got a job at King Soopers, ended up going to Westwood College, got my associates in HVAC, ended up getting into the apprenticeship program, became a pipe fitter, and I've been doing that ever since. So next May will be 20 years doing that. And I've got to work around a lot of people, you know, and it seems like every job I'm on, the Lord always has somebody, and there's always a conversation that can open up to where I can share my testimony with them, or I can tell them about Jesus somehow, some way. You know what I mean? Try to use wisdom. I always, you know, I try to make sure it's authentic, and I just go into it as, you know, the Lord needs us everywhere. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter where you're at. You know, I mean, for the longest time, I wanted to do 100% music, you know, for ministry, 100%. Even prayed and asked God when I was in my apprenticeship, 5-year apprenticeship program. I'm like 3 years in. I'm like, Lord, I don't want to do this anymore. I just want to make music. You know what I mean? Please let me leave. And it was just like, the Lord didn't answer me on that one. And I kind of took it as like, no, man, I need you here. You know what I mean? I have plans for you. You're going to touch some people in this place. You know, so we don't know what we're doing or who you're going to reach. You get to the point where you just trust God's plans. And I know that he has plans, you know, for all those who believe in him. And we're going to keep growing. He's going to keep using us.
Amen. And hey, listen, in closing, I'd love to, for you, first do 2 things. First, share with us how can people get in touch with you and how they can listen to your music. And then lastly, what advice would you tell to your older self? Someone who is lost, maybe they accidentally stumbled on this video and they're watching this. What would you tell that person?
I would tell you this, living that kind of lifestyle, don't get me wrong, it's fun in the beginning, but eventually it wears thin. And you might already be at that point now to where you're feeling just like how I felt, empty inside. Something's missing. You're starting to think maybe about life and death a little bit more. Look at this world. We're not guaranteed to go anywhere and be safe. Nowhere. You might be thinking about life and death. You know, I would tell you right now that God is trying to get a hold of your heart. He's letting you know that there is a better way, and it's found through Jesus Christ. It's found through his son. Jesus went and he paid an awesome price for us. That's the whole reason why Jesus came. He came and died on that cross for us. He rose on the third day, and now he's seated above all things, and he can save anyone. I mean, I'm just a nobody who knows somebody who can save anybody. That person's Jesus Christ, and that's what he's doing. He's knocking on your heart. He's letting you know that's empty, but come drink from the water that Jesus gives, the living water that'll lead you to eternal life. And all you have to do, you don't have to go to church. You can do it right here. You can do it right now. You can ask Jesus into your heart. That's what this life is all about. You just simply pray this prayer right now. Just say, "Dear Lord Jesus, I know that I've sinned. I've messed up. I feel empty. Lord, I want to be made new again. I don't truly know you. I don't know everything that you did for me. But if you can save that man, then I believe that you can save me. So Lord Jesus, please, here right now, forgive me for my sins. Wash me clean. I give you permission right now, Lord, to come into my heart and to save me and to write my name in your book, that I may have everlasting life." And if you prayed that prayer right there and you meant it with your heart, it's a done deal. You've passed from death unto life and you're born again. That means that when you live this life and you take your final breath, you have a place with God and you'll be with him for all eternity. And I would encourage you, open up that book, open up the Bible, read it with an open heart, and you'll see that his word is true and that he has, the word of God says he has pleasures. He has pleasures for us, man. At his right hand, you know what I mean? Pleasures forevermore. And then begin your journey with Jesus. Jesus is the way.
Amen.
Amen.
Art, you've been so generous with your time. I just want to say a huge thank you. And before we leave, can you let everyone know how they can get in touch with you and where they can listen to your music?
Yes. You can, if you look up Servant on YouTube, it's SIR, hit the space bar, VAANT. So my rap name is Servant, and it's kind of like a slang for servant. So you can find me on YouTube. You can find my music on Apple Music, Spotify, on all your major streaming platforms. I'm also on TikTok. You can look up at the Silencer, just the at, and then THESILENSA. And then you guys can find my music and get a hold of me that way too. Even if you go into my YouTube and then you reach out through comments or whatever, I'll reply back.
Sounds good. And I'll make sure to include everything in the description below. So if you didn't get any of that, just check the description below. You'll see all the links. Art, thank you so much. Hey, have a blessed rest of the day. And thank you again for sharing your journey with us, man.
Man, God bless you guys. God bless you, brother. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for watching this interview. I hope you enjoyed it. And let's keep this conversation going. I want to chat with you in our private community at family.godsvoiceday.com. It's completely free, so join it. Let's keep this conversation going. And if you love near-death experiences, then I have another very powerful testimony that you don't want to miss. It should be coming up here on the screen. The next video is with my friend Mark Nelson, who lived a homosexual lifestyle, died, flatlined for 22 minutes, and had an encounter with the living God. So you don't want to miss that testimony. Check the description below if you don't see it popping up here on the screen. But until next time, have a great rest of the day. And I look forward to chatting with you in our private community at family.godsvoiceday.com. Talk soon. Bye-bye.